The gunfire shattered the silence along Route 197 that night, as Willis Mark Haynes stood beside the van, watching three young women collapse on the cold federal ground. Willis Mark Haynes grew up in a very unstable home. During his trial, several people described his childhood as broken and chaotic. Reporters mentioned that his father had a long record of run-ins with the law, while his mother struggled with mental health problems. His defense team used this background to explain how his early life might have influenced the path he later took. These details weren't meant to excuse his actions, but to help the jury understand who he was and how he reached that point. Court records showed that Haynes had faced legal trouble even before the tragic night involving the three women. There isn't much public information about his early years, but what exists paints a picture of instability, poor guidance, and repeated problems with the law. Prosecutors later said that this unstable foundation shaped the choices that led him to choose the wrong path. On the night of January 26, going into the early hours of January 27, 1996, Haynes was part of a group whose night ended in tragedy on federal land near Route 197 in Prince George's County, Maryland. There were 6 people involved, 3 men and 3 women. They met that night in Washington, D.C. and went back to an apartment in Laurel. At some point, an argument broke out. The 3 women left the apartment, but the men followed. What began as a simple ride home turned into a stop on a quiet stretch of road inside federal property. What happened next was the forced taking of 3 women, Tamika Black, Tangi Jackson, and Michonne Chin, which ended with their lives being taken. Investigators linked Haynes to the case through police work, witness statements, and several confessions. He admitted multiple times to his role in what happened, though his story changed more than once as the investigation continued. Eventually, he told police that he was the one who used the weapon that ended the women's lives. Prosecutors used his statements, along with physical evidence and testimony from other people involved, to show that he was directly responsible. Because the incident took place on federal land, the case became a federal matter. This meant it was handled in federal court under national laws, which allowed for the toughest possible penalties. You might wonder why those 3 women were targeted that night. Prosecutors said the motive came from a confrontation earlier that evening. They claimed that one of the women had rejected unwanted attention, and that this led to an argument which later escalated. The defense disagreed, saying the motive didn't make sense, and that witnesses who made deals with prosecutors couldn't be trusted. The story presented in court was full of contradictions. The government described it as a planned and deliberate act, while Haynes's defense said it was driven by confusion, substances, and fear. Testimonies were inconsistent, and both sides fought over which version of events was true. Haynes was charged along with Dustin John Higgs and Victor Gloria in late 1998. During Haynes's trial in 2000, the jury heard testimony placing him at the scene with a firearm. In May 2000, the jury found him guilty on several charges, including taking the lives of the 3 women and unlawful restraint. When it came time for sentencing, the jury decided not to recommend the harshest punishment available. Instead, in August 2000, the judge gave Haynes the maximum possible prison sentence short of that, several life terms running at the same time, plus an additional 45 years for the firearm charges. Haynes appealed his conviction, arguing that some of his statements to police should not have been used, and that the court had made errors during the trial. The appeals court reviewed those claims, but rejected them, keeping his conviction in place. This meant Haynes would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Another major question surrounded his connection to Dustin Higgs, the man prosecutors said had ordered the act. Higgs received the harshest possible punishment, while Haynes, the one who carried it out, received life. During Higgs's trial, prosecutors said that Higgs pressured or directed Haynes to take action. Haynes's early statements seemed to confirm that story. Witnesses also described Higgs as being the one in control that night. But years later, in 2012, Haynes changed his account. In a sworn statement, he said that Higgs had not forced him, and that the earlier story told by prosecutors was false. That statement reignited debate about who was truly responsible for the decision to take the women's lives. Many people still see that question as unresolved. Throughout the case, the motives and testimonies kept shifting. Sometimes Haynes's own words were used against him, while other times they supported his defense. Prosecutors described a calculated act, but the defense pointed to Haynes's emotional instability, intoxication, and influence from others. The jury had to weigh conflicting witness accounts and unclear details, a difficult task when so many people involved had made deals or changed their stories. When the sentence was read, the judge noted the seriousness of what had happened and said Haynes showed little or no regret. Family members of the three women cried in the courtroom. Haynes's own relatives sat quietly as the life terms were announced. For the victims' families, the sentence brought some closure, but the later appeals and public discussions kept the case alive for many years. The lives of Tamika Black, Tangi Jackson, and Mishan Chin were remembered in court and in news reports, their jobs, relationships, and plans for the future. As of recent public records, Willis Mark Haynes is serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Beaumont, Texas. The next case started with strange online videos and ended with bullet holes in one of the most protected buildings on Earth. Oscar Ortega Hernandez grew up in Idaho Falls, Idaho. His family was of Mexican descent. People who knew him described him as polite and quiet for most of his life. But in the months before November 2011, something changed. Public records show he had a few minor legal issues. He had once taken items without paying, was caught with banned items, and had been to court over child support. There was also a small domestic dispute. None of these issues seemed serious enough to suggest what he would later do. Friends later told investigators that, before the White House incident, he began to act differently. He pulled away from his usual friends and started talking about strange things. He said the world was about to end and that powerful people were working on secret plans. He also said that former President Barack Obama had to be stopped. He began recording videos where he made grand claims about being chosen for a special purpose. He also warned that disaster was coming. These videos would later become a key part of the case when lawyers tried to explain his behavior. On the night of November 11, 2011, Ortega Hernandez drove into Washington, D.C. He parked his car on Constitution Avenue near the White House. From inside the car, he pointed a rifle out the window and fired several times toward the building. At least 8 bullets hit the upper floors of the White House. One bullet got stuck in a window frame near the Truman balcony. Others hit the walls and the roof. The shooting caused damage worth nearly $100,000. Secret Service officers were nearby. Fortunately, no one inside the building was harmed. The President and First Lady were away at the time. However, the First Lady's mother and the Obama's younger daughter were in the residence that night. Investigators later found that the bullets matched a rifle left behind by Ortega Hernandez. He had crashed his car several blocks away and abandoned it. Inside the car, agents found the rifle, used bullet casings, loaded magazines, and other proof linking him to the shooting. The federal government treated the case as more than just property damage. They considered it an act that could fall under laws related to terrorism. After the crash, Ortega Hernandez disappeared for a few days. He stayed in different hotels and moved around by train. Police across several states were looking for him. Finally, a hotel worker in Indiana, Pennsylvania, recognized him from a wanted notice and called the authorities. Agents searched his online activity and found his videos. They also spoke to his friends and family. A clear pattern appeared. He had written long, emotional posts filled with religious statements and end-of-world warnings. He often mentioned President Obama as a figure of evil. Prosecutors said this showed his motive. His lawyers, however, argued that these were signs of serious mental health problems. A grand jury later charged him with several counts, including an attempt to harm the president, as well as weapons-related charges. As investigators looked deeper, they found a mix of radical beliefs and personal instability. Ortega Hernandez told people that he thought he had been chosen for a special mission. He believed the president was a danger to humanity. In his videos, he called himself the second coming of Christ and spoke about the end times. He said the government was spying on people. He had bought an AK-style rifle months before the event. He purchased hundreds of bullets, practiced shooting in a remote desert area, and even added a scope to his weapon. These details showed that he had planned his actions carefully. Still, his defense team used the same facts to argue that he was not thinking clearly. They said his decisions came from confusion and delusion. not from a political agenda. Prosecutors claimed he acted out of hatred toward the president and wanted to cause panic. The defense asked the court to see him as someone deeply unwell and deserving of treatment instead of severe punishment. The case went through the federal court system, with both sides making strong arguments. At first, Ortega Hernandez faced 17 charges. These included trying to harm the president, using a dangerous weapon against federal officers, and several weapon-related offenses. But in September 2013, he decided to take a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty to 2 charges, one for damaging a government building and another for firing a weapon. In court, he admitted that what he did was treated as a terrorist act for sentencing purposes. In return, prosecutors dropped the other charges, including the one for trying to harm the president. That charge alone could have resulted in life in prison. The plea deal set some limits on how long he could be punished. Still, it allowed the judge to give a long sentence after applying the terrorism-related guidelines. When it came time for sentencing in March 2014, the government pushed for a harsh punishment, close to 27.5 years. Prosecutors said his actions were meant to spread fear and could have put lives in danger. His defense team asked for a lighter sentence of about 10 years. They said Ortega Hernandez was dealing with mental health struggles and depression at that time, which should be considered. The judge decided on a middle ground based on the plea deal. She sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay around $94,000 for damage to the White House. He would also spend 5 years under supervision after finishing his sentence. The judge said the punishment reflected how serious the act was, firing at the presidential residence, and the fact that he admitted it was treated as an act of terrorism under the law. This admission raised the range of possible punishment. So, where is Ortega Hernandez now? Public records and official reports have shown him in different federal facilities over time. When he was sentenced, the Justice Department and the FBI confirmed his conviction and listed his expected release date as June 21, 2033. Later, federal inmate records showed that he had been moved between several institutions within the Bureau of Prisons. At different times, listings placed him at facilities like FCI Herlong in California. Some public records also connected him to the Beaumont complex in Texas. Inmates can be transferred for different reasons, such as security reviews or administrative decisions, so locations can change. For the most accurate and updated information, the Bureau of Prisons inmate locator remains the official source. At the time of reporting, Ortega Hernandez was serving a 25-year sentence, with his release still scheduled for 2033. The next individual told everyone he just wanted to be a good father, but the lengths he went to win custody left an entire community horrified. Andrew Charles Beard grew up in North Texas. At the time of the incident, he was living in Rolette. He was the father of a little girl he shared with 24-year-old Alyssa Burkett. Their relationship had fallen apart, and the two were locked in a difficult custody battle. What began as a family dispute would soon turn into a tragic morning that changed many lives. Beard's name appears in official reports and court documents. Prosecutors said he followed the mother of his child, disguised himself, and planned an act in the parking lot where she worked. The events of that morning didn't come out of nowhere. They were the result of a long pattern of stalking and manipulation. According to court filings, Beard used technology and careful planning. He placed a tracking device on Burkett's car, researched ways to stay unnoticed, and even bought a black SUV just for that day. Investigators later found several clues in his home and vehicle. They discovered a battery that matched the tracker, hiking boots that had been cut and cleaned with bleach, and notes and online searches that showed clear preparation. In the weeks before the incident, prosecutors said Beard went even further. He planted fake evidence in Burkett's car, including illegal items, and called the police using a false name. He tried to make it look like she was doing something wrong, so that the authorities would target her instead. This changed the situation from a family dispute into a serious investigation of stalking and planned harm. On October 2, 2020, everything came to a breaking point. Burkett arrived at the parking lot of the apartment complex where she worked. Beard, wearing a disguise, drove there in the same black SUV he had bought for the plan. Evidence later showed he used dark makeup and a fake beard to change his look. According to prosecutors, Beard approached her car while she was inside and fired a gun through the window. Believing she was gone, he tried to escape. But when Burkett managed to get out of the car and run toward safety, he came back and used a sharp object on her several times. The official count listed 13 wounds in total. Witnesses and surveillance footage helped investigators piece together what happened and confirm Beard's role that morning. Why would someone go that far? Prosecutors said the main reason was the custody battle. At the center of everything was a 1-year-old child. Both parents loved her deeply, but the situation had turned into a struggle for control. Beard's lawyers admitted that the custody issue was the main cause of conflict. Prosecutors claimed he believed that if Burkett was out of the picture, he could get full custody of their daughter. But there was another person who made things even worse: Beard's fiancée, Holly Elkins. Investigators said Elkins played a key role in what happened. They described how she followed and harassed Burkett for months, planted false evidence, and encouraged Beard's actions. During her trial, prosecutors said Elkins was obsessed with the idea of being with Beard and raising his child. They argued that she helped create the plan and supported Beard in carrying it out. Her involvement turned what could have been an act of emotion into a carefully organized act. The investigation moved quickly once officers focused on Beard. They stopped him a few hours later while he was driving away from his home. His phone contained searches and other material that connected him to the planning of the act. Forensic testing matched DNA and other evidence to the SUV he had recently purchased. When officers searched his home, they found a tracker battery and proof of the earlier staged tip. Beard was taken into custody and charged in state court. Later, he also faced federal charges after agents found a silencer and other items that broke federal firearm laws. Federal authorities took over the case once they confirmed national laws had been violated. As more information became public, the story gained major attention. Local and national news outlets covered it closely, followed later by documentaries that traced a story of stalking, planning, and a harmful event in a parking lot. Beard's case in federal court ended with a guilty plea. On June 22, 2022, he admitted in court to using online tools and a dangerous weapon to harm someone, and to firing a gun. These admissions were directly tied to the surveillance, tracking, and the final act itself. In May 2023, U.S. District Judge Jane J. Boyle sentenced Beard to 43 years in federal prison. During sentencing, his attorney said Beard had finally expressed regret to both his family and Alyssa's family in open court. That moment stood in sharp contrast to the disturbing evidence presented during the trial. Even after the federal sentence, prosecutors in Texas said state-level proceedings could still move forward. It served as a reminder that federal outcomes do not always close cases at the state level. Investigators later revealed how the plan unfolded step by step. The black SUV used in the act was found less than a mile from Beard's home. Forensic experts matched DNA found inside the vehicle to the victim. Detectives also discovered makeup vials and a fake beard, which interviews suggested were used to change Beard's appearance and confuse witnesses. They even found a written script and a false name Beard used to make a staged complaint the month before the act. Together, this evidence showed that what happened was not a sudden outburst. It was a planned operation involving surveillance, planted evidence, disguise, and a final act of harm. Investigators also uncovered the role of another person, Holly Elkins. They described her as the one who guided the plan. She provided information, encouraged each step, and helped isolate Burkett. Elkins was later charged and tried in court. Jurors found her guilty, and in August 2024, she received 2 consecutive life sentences for directing the plan and being involved in the events that led to the tragedy. Prosecutors said her conviction confirmed that this was not just the action of one jealous person. It was a long-term scheme by more than one person, aimed at removing a woman so another could take her place in a child's life. As for Beard, reports stated that he remains in federal custody at a high-security facility. Some sources have linked him to USP Beaumont, a well-known federal institution. In short, Beard continues to serve his time under federal supervision. The next man called himself a wealth manager. The government called him the architect of a $100 million fraud. And if you find stories like this important, Consider subscribing. Adli Husni Abdul Wahab was once a successful businessman from the Houston area. But over time, he became known for being at the center of one of the biggest financial scams involving life insurance investments after the year 2000. He ran companies under names like A&O and others, presenting them as hedge fund-style investment firms. These companies promised investors steady profits by buying and reselling life insurance policies. To investors, the plan sounded safe and professional. The idea was to buy insurance policies from older people at a discount, wait until the policy ended, then collect the insurance payout and share the profits. But in reality, the money wasn't being used that way. Instead, large amounts were spent on luxury items, personal expenses, and misleading operations. A federal jury later found that Abdul Wahab and his partners had created a plan that took around $100 million from more than 800 investors. It all started in the mid-2000s, when the life settlement investment market began to grow faster than the regulations controlling it. Abdul Wahab and his team marketed their company, A&O Resource Management, as a large, successful firm with multiple offices and an experienced staff. They promised that investor money would be handled carefully and professionally. But investigators later found that this wasn't true. The team exaggerated the company's success, overstated its assets, and gave false information about how the funds were being used. Many of their investors were veterans and retirees looking for a safe way to earn a steady income. They were shown brochures and charts that made everything look secure, but their money was secretly being redirected into risky ventures and personal spending. Some victims later testified that they lost their entire savings, leaving them with no way to recover financially. The operation itself was designed to look legitimate. Agents sold group investments that were supposedly backed by life insurance policies. They claimed there were special accounts and systems in place to protect investors' money. But that was false. The funds were mixed together and used to pay sales commissions, support failing projects, or cover personal purchases. Investigators from the government later traced large sums of money moving from investor accounts into personal spending. In one report, officials summarized it clearly, saying Abdul Wahab had taken part in a $100 million scheme that tricked more than 800 people across the United States and Canada. They said greed was the main driving force behind it, a constant desire for a more expensive lifestyle and the need to use new money to hide old losses. Many people wondered why so many victims believed the promises. The answer came down to trust. The sales agents knew exactly how to gain people's confidence. They targeted older individuals, using calm and professional language that made the deals sound low risk. They provided fake office locations, false documents, and made-up success stories. Because these investment structures seemed legitimate, many people didn't realize something was wrong until their savings were gone. The case became widely known in 2011. A jury in Richmond found Abdul Wahab guilty on several counts, including conspiracy, wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The evidence presented in court included witness statements, bank records, and company communications, showing how the money had been taken and misused. The jury decided that it wasn't just poor management. It was a planned financial deception from the start. During sentencing, several victims spoke about how their retirement plans were destroyed and how their families suffered. In September of 2011, a federal judge in Hector, Richmond gave Abdul Wahab a 60-year prison sentence for his role in the $100 million scheme. The court said the size of the loss and the number of victims made it one of the most serious financial frauds of its time. The judge made it clear that this was not a case of bad business decisions, but a deliberate act of dishonesty that caused real harm to many lives. Anyone who follows financial wrongdoing cases knows that appeals often come afterward. Abdul Wahab's lawyers challenged some parts of his convictions. In April 2013, the Fourth Circuit Court reviewed his case. The court overturned several money-related counts, saying there were legal mistakes in how those charges were applied. However, the main fraud and conspiracy findings stayed in place. The ruling meant that Abdul Wahab had to be sentenced again for the remaining charges. The decision didn't erase what the jury found, that investors had been deceived and their funds taken dishonestly. It only limited the legal grounds for some of the earlier charges. The case went back to the lower court for resentencing. In August 2013, Abdul Wahab was given 60 years for the remaining convictions. Prosecutors and the judge said that even though some counts had been dropped, the remaining ones were serious enough to justify a long sentence. They said the victims suffered real harm and that Abdul Wahhab's actions showed a clear pattern of deceit. Around that same time, there were other related cases. One of them involved W Financial Group, which led to more convictions and a 10-year sentence in the Northern District of Texas. The judge ordered that sentence to be served after the one in Virginia. This meant Abdul Wahhab would spend even more time in prison. During the trials and appeals, Abdul Wahhab's defense team argued that he wasn't the only one responsible. They claimed that his partners were also involved and that some of the payments in question were legitimate business expenses, not illegal gains. Some of his co-defendants chose to cooperate with the authorities and received lighter sentences. The defense also said the situation came from complicated business disputes and poor record-keeping rather than intentional wrongdoing. However, the courts disagreed. They said the evidence clearly showed misleading statements, misuse of investor funds, and dishonest sales methods used to secure investments. Was his punishment typical for this kind of offense? Sentences for financial wrongdoing can vary a lot, but the court emphasized that many of the victims were older and financially vulnerable, and their losses were significant. Judges often consider those details very seriously. The 60-year term was considered very strict. It reflected not just the amount of money involved, but also the emotional and personal harm the victims suffered. News reports shared how victims spoke in court about their losses: savings gone, retirement dreams ruined. The judge described the scheme as a terrible wrongdoing. Abdul Wahhab was ordered to pay millions in restitution and faced property forfeiture. The Texas sentence was to be served after the Virginia one, which meant he would remain in custody for many years. The next man raised millions for families in need, and was later accused of helping an organization he never met. Shukri Abu Baker was known as a quiet organizer and charity leader. He was not the kind of person many expected to see in federal legal files. He was born in 1959 and was of Palestinian and Brazilian background. He spent parts of his childhood in Palestine and Kuwait before moving to the United States in 1980. After settling there, he helped create the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development. For years, the foundation collected donations from mosques and communities across the country. The money was used to send food, school supplies, and orphan support to families in Palestinian areas. During the 1990s and early 2000s, it became one of the largest Muslim charities in America. But later, that same organization became the center of a major federal case that changed Abu Baker's life. The government accused the Holy Land Foundation of being more than a charity. Prosecutors said it had sent funds to groups that were linked to Hamas, which the U.S. government had labeled a foreign organization involved in dangerous acts. According to the prosecution, the charity sent money to zakat committees and other organizations that were controlled by or connected to Hamas. In court, they presented surveillance records, intelligence reports, and financial documents to support this claim. The jury in Texas was asked to decide whether the donations raised in the U.S. had ended up helping organizations tied to Hamas, even indirectly. The government said this meant Abu Baker and his co-defendants had joined in an unlawful plan to support a foreign organization. The trial lasted for a long time and was closely followed by the public. People who watched the case saw two very different stories. The government described years of investigation, witness testimony, and evidence gathered under new laws created after the acts of September 11. Defense lawyers told a different story. They said the Holy Land Foundation's goal was to help those in need and that the funds were used for humanitarian purposes only. They argued that the foundation had no part in any harmful actions. In the end, the jury sided with the government. In November 2008, Shukri Abu Baker and other leaders were found guilty on several counts related to conspiracy, financial wrongdoing, and providing support to a designated foreign organization. After the verdict, many people wondered why the charity leaders received such long sentences when public records did not show direct involvement in harm. The government's answer was based on the law. It argued that even if the money was intended for relief work, sending it to organizations linked to a designated group still counted as providing material support. Prosecutors said that money is interchangeable. and by supporting these committees, the foundation indirectly helped Hamas by freeing its resources. Defense lawyers said this interpretation was unfair. They believed it punished people who were simply trying to provide humanitarian aid. They warned that such rulings could discourage future charitable work, especially within faith-based communities. The case raised difficult questions about how to protect national security without harming legitimate charity efforts. In May 2009, the court delivered its sentences. Shukri Abu Baker received 65 years in federal prison. 2 other founders received similar sentences, while others got shorter terms. The Department of Justice said these sentences were necessary to prevent funds from reaching groups the government viewed as dangerous. For Abu Baker, this meant he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case did not end there. Abu Baker's defense team filed appeals, claiming errors were made during the trial and that the laws had been applied too broadly. The Fifth Circuit Court reviewed the case and released detailed rulings. However, most of the defense arguments were rejected, and the original sentences remained. For Abu Baker's family, the outcome brought deep personal loss. They had once seen the foundation as a symbol of compassion and relief. Now they faced years of separation and the lasting impact of a case that began with charity work and ended in a courtroom. Once his appeals were denied and the sentence was confirmed, Abu Baker was moved into the federal prison system. He has been kept in high-security facilities, including the United States Penitentiary in Beaumont, Texas. This complex holds some of the country's most closely monitored inmates. Reports from advocacy groups and his family describe the conditions as harsh. His case has become a rallying point for people who believe his trial was unfair or influenced by politics. Supporters have organized campaigns asking for a review or a pardon. On the other hand, those who oppose him say the jury's decision and the sentence prove that the law was applied correctly. Today, the man who once led a charity lives under strict supervision in a federal penitentiary. If his sentence runs its full course, he is expected to remain in custody until the 2060s. So, how did a man devoted to charity work end up spending decades behind bars? The short answer is linked to laws created after the September 11 attacks and the changes in how authorities track financial activities. The longer answer is more complex. It involves new definitions of what counts as support, the use of foreign intelligence, and the political atmosphere of the early 2000s when anti-terror efforts expanded into financial investigations. The Holy Land Foundation case was not an ordinary legal proceeding. It became a major test of how donations could be restricted if the receiving organizations were believed by the government to have ties with banned groups. For Abu Baker, this meant several convictions and a long sentence that, in practice, amounts to life in prison. From inside, Abu Baker has continued to communicate through letters and writings that have reached his supporters and some media platforms. He has written various materials and, according to reports, even worked on a collection of writings while serving his time. For those observing from the outside, the legacy of this case depends on perspective. To prosecutors and national security officials, the Holy Land Foundation case proved that the government could trace money and use laws against financial support to disrupt possible funding chains. To civil rights advocates and many in the Muslim community, it represented government overreach. They believed the case relied too heavily on classified evidence and arguments that could turn ordinary humanitarian aid into a punishable act. For Abu Baker's family, the impact is deeply personal. They have faced years of separation, financial struggles from legal expenses, and the pain of seeing a father once known for helping others now confined behind bars. His daughters grew up watching his life change, from community meetings and fundraisers to court hearings, and then to a prison cell. The effects of that change are still felt today. The next act lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was enough to lock down every federal prison in the country. Juan Carlos Rivas Moreira wasn't just a name in the story of the Beaumont incident. He was one of the main people involved in starting it. Public court records and filings from the Department of Justice mention him by name and by several other versions of it, such as Juan Carlos Moreira and Stocky. They describe him as a high-ranking member and leader within the MS-13 group. At that time, he was already serving a life term for gang-related activity. The events at the U.S. Penitentiary in Beaumont in late January of 2022 added another serious chapter to that record. Picture a crowded housing unit inside a high-security prison. Rival groups had long-standing grudges. Orders often spread through coded messages, visitors, and hidden communications. On January 31, 2022, 7 MS-13 members gathered in one housing area. Their targets were men identified as part of rival groups, the Sureños, and one man linked to the Mexican mafia. According to the indictment and later court statements, Rivas Moreira came up behind one of the targets, Guillermo Riojas, and struck him twice in the chest. Riojas fell immediately. Others then joined in. The aggressiveness spread quickly from one person to another. What started as a sudden confrontation turned into a short but intense series of assaults that left 2 people lifeless and 2 others badly hurt. Federal prosecutors said the whole incident lasted only a few minutes. It triggered emergency responses and led to a major lockdown across the federal prison system. The official reports describe harsh physical details. Riojas had deep wounds that affected his heart and lungs. Another man, Andrew Pineda, suffered 46 separate injuries on both his front and back. He did not survive. 2 other members of the Sureños group were also wounded many times, but managed to live after being taken to a hospital for emergency care. These details, repeated in court filings, showed how deliberate and organized the incident was. It was not a fight that simply got out of hand, but a planned act meant to remove rivals. But why would inmates carry out such a planned act inside a federal prison? Court documents and reports from the Department of Justice point to tensions within gang alliances. The MS-13 leadership in El Salvador, known as the Ranfla Nacional, had been trying to gain more independence from the Mexican mafia and the Sureños. This shift caused friction. Prosecutors said MS-13 leaders ordered harmful action to prove their authority, punish rivals, and send a message that their group could still act powerfully, even from another country. In simple terms, the motive described in court papers was control and revenge within the gang's chain of command. Rivas Moreira's part in it was not small. He was identified as the person who started the event by striking Riojas first. That single act led others to follow. Federal prosecutors treated the entire event as part of a larger organized conspiracy, not just an isolated incident. In April 2022, 7 MS-13 members were charged with organized crime conspiracy and other related offenses. The indictment said that if convicted, they could face the most severe punishment allowed in federal court, including life in prison. The investigation that followed was large and detailed. The FBI and Bureau of Prisons investigators said they conducted more than 100 interviews. They reviewed hours of surveillance footage and collected weapons and other banned items linked to the event. These steps helped build the case that eventually led from indictment to plea deals. For Rivas Moreira, it meant additional life terms. The nationwide lockdown that followed the Beaumont incident, which kept inmates confined for nearly a week, showed how seriously authorities took the threat and how quickly it affected the entire prison system. Rivas Moreira did not go to a full jury trial on the later organized crime charges. On July 2, 2024, he pleaded guilty to his role in the conspiracy tied to MS-13 and to the incident inside Beaumont. His plea made him the last defendant to admit guilt in that case. The others had already been convicted or sentenced. Prosecutors noted that his plea confirmed his part in the planning and coordination of the assault that ended 2 lives and left others injured. A guilty plea in federal court usually follows strong evidence and discussions between both sides about the possible outcomes. In Rivas Moreira's situation, his plea did not reduce his punishment much, since he was already serving a life term, and the new charges were equally serious. Finally, at sentencing in late April 2025, a federal judge gave Rivas Moreira another life term in prison. Prosecutors described the Beaumont assault as one of the most violent events ever seen in a Texas prison. They highlighted how the orders for it came from MS-13 leaders in El Salvador. Court records and statements from the U.S. Attorney's Office show that the new sentence was meant to reflect both the personal harm of that day and the broader danger posed by organized networks that operate across borders. This new life term was added to the one he was already serving for earlier gang-related offenses. Up next is 1 bullet, one mistake, and 3 children were left without their mother. Hector Ramirez's story begins on the streets of Chelsea, Massachusetts. He was born in Honduras and later moved to the United States, where his life started to take a darker path. He joined a local group known as the Enfermos Criminales Salvatrucha, a branch of MS-13. By the early 2010s, this group was active in several cities across New England. Court files and official records show that Ramirez didn't stay a small-time member for long. He moved from minor street activity to more serious acts carried out for the group. These included physical confrontations, armed thefts, and shootings that eventually caught the attention of federal investigators. In the spring of 2014, the Enfermos clique began to act more aggressively. Records connect Ramirez to an incident on March 28, 2014, where he and others injured and stole from a man while he carried a blade. Just a few weeks later, on April 9, 2014, he and another person took valuables from a man using what turned out to be a fake firearm. Then came October 18, 2014, the day that changed everything. According to court documents, Ramirez fired a gun on a Chelsea street, aiming at a rival group member. The shot missed and instead hit Catherine Gomez, a mother of 3, who was looking out the window of a shelter where she lived with her children. The bullet took her life instantly. Ramirez admitted in court that he was responsible for that shot. These acts were not random street incidents. They were part of a much larger federal case against MS-13's East Coast operations. In 2017, a federal grand jury added Ramirez to a major indictment that tied him to a series of harmful acts between 2013 and 2014. He later admitted to the racketeering charge, acknowledging his role in the theft, the attempted striking, and the shooting that caused the loss of Catherine Gomez's life. In April 2018, a federal judge sentenced him to 27 years in prison, followed by supervision after release. The court made it clear that Ramirez was seen as a dangerous MS-13 member, whose actions caused serious harm and loss of life. But how did his name end up in the news again years later, this time for a fatal event inside a federal prison? The answer lies in how the federal system moves inmates. After his Massachusetts conviction, Ramirez was transferred through several prisons, as is common for inmates involved in major cases. Transfers can happen for housing, classification, or security reasons. They can also group members of the same organization together, which sometimes leads to more trouble behind bars. Records show that by January 31, 2022, Ramirez was at USP Beaumont in Texas. On that day, several MS-13 members, as we have discussed in the previous case, coordinated an act on people they saw as rivals inside the prison. Ramirez was later named as one of 7 men involved. The event resulted in 2 people losing their lives and 2 others being badly hurt. For his part in that incident, he received another 30-year federal sentence in April 2025. So how did Ramirez keep choosing the wrong path, both on the streets and in prison? Court records and investigators pointed to the same reason: gang culture. Within MS-13, members gained status and respect by proving their loyalty through violent acts. These actions helped the group control territory and retaliate against anyone they saw as opposition. Investigators later found more evidence on his phone. It included photos of firearms, group symbols, and messages linking him to other members who planned such missions. His plea in 2017 and his sentencing the next year weren't just about one act. They represented an entire pattern of behavior,